I am Tamar Ish Shalom, and this is Jewish Crossroads. My guest today is Dr. Einat Wilf, a thinker, historian, Knesset member, and author. Wilf holds a PhD in government from Harvard University, written extensively on Zionism, democracy, education, and Israel's place in the region. She served in the Knesset for the Labor Party and since then has undergone a significant ideological shift, becoming a prominent voice challenging long-held assumptions about the conflict and about the future of Israeli policy. She has been active in public life through writing, speaking, and advocacy, and recently she founded a new political party called Oz. Shalom Einat, and welcome to Jewish Crossroads.
Shalom Tamar, thank you.
So in recent years, you focused a lot of your work on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and we'll get to that, of course. But actually, I want to start with something else. You've been deeply connected to the Jewish community in the United States for many years. You're a familiar voice in American Jewish discourse, and I think you even appear more on American Jewish media and outlets than in Israeli ones. How do you analyze the rise of anti-Semitism in America after October 7th, but more specifically, its persistence 2 years later? I mean, the war is over, anti-Semitism is still here with us.
So I'll make perhaps what might sound an odd claim, that it was not really about the war, ever. I'll start with a quote by one of my favorite writers, Hussein Abu Bakr Mansour. He has a Substack. He's an Egyptian who de-radicalized himself to the sheer power of critical thinking. And he wrote that the kind of the euphoric demonstrations on October 7th, 8th, he defined them as a symbolic participation in the pogrom. He basically expressed what I think is very true, that what they saw on that day on their social media through the GoPro cameras is essentially, and I'm going to say something that sounds crazy, but I'll make the case of why it's true, what they saw on that day is the birthing of utopia. Because the way I understand anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism as its new respectable mask is that they're not about hatred or prejudices. They are a whole worldview that says that we could have a better world, utopia, and what stands between us and the better world is the collective Jew. And this is clearly the most dangerous and ancient thinking, certainly when it comes to Jews, but to societies in general. And the way that that's been prepared, just like we woke up to the physical horrific elements on October 7th in Israel, what happened in the world on October 7th is that we realized that just as they dug actual tunnels from Gaza, they dug what I call metaphorical tunnels in the West. And these metaphorical tunnels, there's extensive scholarship about it now, has been dug by the Arab world and the Islamic world and the Soviet world. And they dug those metaphorical tunnels for decades. And they dug them through something that I've called the placard strategy, because you see it in anti-Israel demonstrations on the placards. It's the equation of Israel, Zionism, the Star of David, with everything that is evil, right? The placard strategy has been so successful that we know what Israel and Zionism and the Star of David are equated with, and it's not the political movement for self-determination of the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland. It's imperialism and colonialism and racism and apartheid, and then it escalates, ethnic cleansing, Nazism, genocide. I heard the word genocide for at least 15 years, in case anyone wants to pretend that it is
much
the
before
outcome.
October 7th.
Absolutely. There was even a year when no one was dying. You remember there were those years. And I was in a panel, and the Palestinian speaker said, Israel's committing cultural genocide. And I remember listening to that and thinking, what is that even? And then I realized it didn't matter. What he was doing is implementing this endless repetition. Israel, genocide. That's all that mattered. Create that endless repetition so that people, our brain responds not to truth, but to comfort and repetition, and people begin to perceive it as reality. So what actually happens in Gaza was never going to stop it.
Einat, one of the troubling trends over the past 2 years has been the simultaneous rise of anti-Semitism, both on the left that you've just described and in the right. I mean, it's almost like a historical pincer movement, and the reluctance of leaders on both sides to confront the anti-Semites in their camp. Do you think we've reached the peak and now, we'll see a decline in anti-Semitism? Or has a kind of wild, animal been now let loose after decades, which social taboos kept it in shape, since World War II. And now the animal is free and is fed very well by social media. So which of the two?
I will lean more to the second. I'll try to give a bit of hope, why I hope for the first and where I find hope for the first. A bit on the second. For many years, I debated whether anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism, and it was long before October 7th, and I would lose those debates, right, because they would parade out the anti-Zionist Jew. That's why they're so valuable. It has nothing to do with Jews. And after one such debate that had a bit of a pre-pogrom Eve energy to it, I was so rattled that I decided to research more what happens to Jews, actual Jews, when anti-Zionism becomes the law of the land, becomes the ideology of a country, a society, a people, a political party. And here the historical record, tragically, has no exceptions. Everywhere anti-Zionism rose to be the institutional ideology, step one, the environment turned extremely hostile to Jewish collective and individual life. Even as those societies said, we love Jews, we have nothing against Jews, it might be Jews themselves who were at the forefront of these ideas. And then if it's not stopped, no Jews are left. And I once tried to look into why do people keep on using, you spoke about an animal being unleashed. Why do people keep on going to that animal? And we know that anti-Zionism, like anti-Semitism, is the mark of failed societies that need a scapegoat, that are trying to deflect from their failings. And someone once gave me a beautiful metaphor. They said that anti-Semitism is like the ring in Lord of the Rings. So when they gave me that metaphor, I sat down, spent a whole weekend watching the entire trilogy. And
You never saw it before, Einat.
I didn't, I know.
It's the best.
I know. So I sat down and I understood what they wanted to convey. They wanted to convey this notion that the power of the ring is so great that people cannot resist it. And we know that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, you mentioned the two sides, have the power to create political support and coalitions that otherwise would not be caught together. So the power of the ring is great, but ultimately it destroys its wearer. But many people cannot resist the temptation. You talked about the taboos of history. It's not just the taboos, it's even the memory. So people are tempted once more because they forget that it ends up destroying the society. So over the years when I would tell that, people would tell me, Einat, do you have a story where it doesn't end this way? And I'd be like, look, Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, British Jews, which, as you know very well, are very British. They don't like to be those fighters outside. And they understood that if this man would be Prime Minister of Britain, and people forget how close he was to that, this would be the end of Jewish life in Britain. And a lot of Jews who didn't identify even before publicly as Jews in Britain came out, and you remember that very well. And for many years I said, here, this is a success story. And then a lot of British Jews told me, Einat, we're not sure we're out of the woods yet, so we're not sure you can use that. So now I put my hope. You remember that when those overeducated college students were ripping off the posters of the hostages, especially the children, and there was a video that went viral of two construction workers in New York seeing this. I think one was black, one was Hispanic, and they were saying, this is not right. This is not right. And a part of me says, I really, really hope that America, Canada, Britain, France, Australia, they still have that common sense that, as you know, is not so common, that basically looks at all this insanity and says, this is not right, stop it.
Yeah, well, if we zoom in on the left and the Mamdani era that we are, starting to live in, we see like this clear attempt to create the good Jew and the bad Jew, right? I mean, the good Jew is the one that distances himself from Israel and from Zionism, and he's worthy of protection. And the bad Jew is, the majority of Jews in the United States is the one who feels a deep connection to the land of Israel, to the people of Israel, that supports Israel's right to exist. And, God forbid, a Zionist, yes? And I think we saw it clearly recently in Mamdani's response to the Nefesh B'Nefesh outrageous, I don't know even how to call it. It was a demonstration. It was an act of hatred in a synagogue in Manhattan. And yes, he did say the protesters shouldn't be there, but at the same sentence, he said that the event itself shouldn't take place because it's against international law, because part of the Olim by Nefesh B'Nefesh organization go to settlements in Israel. I think, you could see that attempt to create, the good Jew and the bad Jew. What's your take on that?
That is the most insidious mechanism. This is how the assault can actually progress, because, like you said, we essentially have the guardrails against the traditional anti-Semitism. And over the years, I actually struggled when I would speak to groups to let them know that anti-Semitism, when it arose, was a respectable ideology, scientific. Theodor Herzl met it among the University of Vienna, among his colleagues in the University of Vienna, and I would macabrely joke that Hitler gave anti-Semitism a bad name, because when it started, it was actually a respectable ideology. And again, this is why the Soviet Union engineered anti-Zionism as a new respectable replacement, because respectability and prestige is key to how the assault proceeds. And we don't have guardrails against assaults that appear prestigious and respectable and supposedly logical. And I've called this mechanism, I described it many years ago as the pound of flesh dynamic, which in opposition to Shakespeare, it's often the Jews who are demanded to hand over the pound of flesh. And the argument was that this is a bullying dynamic. And in many ways, what happened in the synagogue was a bullying dynamic. Because what characterizes bullying dynamics is that they never stop if you give in to them, right? The more you feed the bully, the more he comes back for your lunch money. And this bullying dynamic of demanding that the Jews hand over a pound of flesh. And we've all noticed, the Jews who try to show that they're the good Jews, they invest so much in proving that they're the good kind of Jews. And yet they too will always have a moment when they're not good enough. Those are always amazing moments when even the most anti-Zionist Jew suddenly says, we shouldn't kill all of them, or they say something that might be construed. And then it's amazing to watch. They're attacked. You are a secret liberal Zionist. We always knew that. And this is the mechanism by which it works. And we know that there's a playbook because it's been played in the Arab world, in Iran, in the Soviet Union, in Eastern Europe. You first criminalize Zionism. You make Zionism, literally, you say it's against this, international law, you criminalize it as an ideology. Canada now is trying to legislate against anti-Palestinian racism, but if you read what it is, it's essentially Zionism. So you criminalize Zionism, and you say it has nothing to do with Jews, right? This is why, again, the good Jews are very critical for that. But then, step two, is you charge Jews with the crime of Zionism, regardless of whether it's true or not. And no Jew will ever be able to repel that charge because they literally just celebrated Passover or Hanukkah, or, they got married and they promised not to forget Jerusalem. And this is how Jews were driven out of Iran and the Arab world and the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. You criminalize Zionism, and then you charge Jews with the crime of Zionism.
Einat, let's shift to your favorite subject in recent years, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I want to talk about the two core ideas you've developed. The first is what you describe as the fundamental problem or the heart of the conflict, the inability of the Palestinians to accept the existence of Israel, what you called Palestinianism. And then there's your proposed solution, which is Arab Zionism. The latter sounds quite frankly like a wild idea, Arab Zionism. Can you unpack those two terms for us?
Certainly. So, as you know, my story grew up, like pretty much everyone at the time in the Israeli political left, with a fervent belief that the only thing that separates us and peace is the establishment of one more Arab state, a Palestinian Arab state in the West Bank and Gaza. I grew up in Jerusalem too. As far as I was concerned, just take it and leave us alone. And I supported, of course, every Israeli prime minister as soon as I could vote, from Rabin to Peres to Barak to Olmert. I supported this engagement. This is like 20 years when I really, really want to make this happen, each and every way. And I watch, this is now not history books, this is my life, I watch how Palestinian leaders, different ones, Arafat, Abu Mazen, walk away from every opportunity, follow it up with violence, and most important, there's never any internal debate about it. And I actually decided to research at one point, is there an example in the last century and a half, when empires are collapsing, new states are established, of a people who claim to want independence, self-determination, liberation, that's the era, get multiple opportunities to achieve that. And it's important to say, achieve that doesn't mean everything. There is not a single nation state that believes that it got all the territory to which it has historical or emotional or legal claim. No one's happy. So do you have any example of people who claim to want that, get multiple opportunities to achieve that, reject it every time, and there are no dissenting voices? And there are none. And only the Palestinians. And ultimately what I realized is that because it's not what they want. It's not what they want. They don't want independence, statehood, self-determination. They're not organized around that idea. Since you said you've heard many of my podcasts, you know that I always bring the quote by Ernst Bevin, the British foreign minister after World War II, where he explains why Britain failed to fulfill the terms of the mandate, why there's no sovereign state for the Jewish people. And he says His Majesty's government is faced with an irreconcilable conflict because the Jews in the land want a sovereign Jewish state. So Zionism is actually a liberation movement and behaves like one. That's why the Jews say yes to much less than they believe they're owed, because
they take what they can.
Yeah, because
all that they want.
Precisely, because they prioritize self-determination. And the Arabs, he says, their top priority is to resist to the last the establishment of Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land. And I've come to call this Palestinianism, this singular obsession with the non-existence of a Jewish state. You spoke about me going through an ideological transformation. I actually make the case that what I'm discussing is not an ideology. I'm discussing an empirical description of what the conflict is about. And my argument is that it's the most empirically based description, which even the Arabs and the Palestinians would support. They would justify their position that there should not be a Jewish state But they will not argue that this is not their position.
So if I understand you correctly, what you're saying are two things. You don't oppose a Palestinian state. You would like to see maybe a two-state solution. You just don't think it's feasible on the Palestinian side. Because for them, that's the second thing you're saying, it's not 1967, it's 1948.
Yeah, I mean, what I love about the whole two-state solution, yes to a Palestinian state, no to a Palestinian state, you know, when Netanyahu says things like, I prevented a Palestinian state, I always tweeted, whenever he says that, I always tweet, it's not nice to take credit for the one achievement that the Palestinian national movement actually has. Because he didn't prevent any state because they never pursued it, not if it means living next to a Jewish state. So I love that Jews are engaging in Talmudic debates about whether to have a Palestinian state, yes or no, but the Palestinian Arabs have never been interested in one, not if it has to live next to a Jewish state. So first, let's recognize it. Let's recognize that this is their ideology. They're organized around that. Unfortunately, there are no exceptions, or there are very, very few exceptions. In that sense, there's no difference between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. They merely argue about the tactics of achieving the goal. Is it better to use violence? Is it better to make Israel a pariah state? As we see, they actually work together very well, but they don't differ on the goal. So let's recognize that this is the ideology. Then a lot of my work is about what are the sources that fuel that ideology, UNRWA, perpetual refugeehood, return.
And I wanted to bring us to what you see as an optional solution, yes. What I say that like sounds crazy, which is Arab Zionism.
Okay. So a word about...
Isn't that a contradiction?
Yes. So a word about Arab Zionism or Islamic Zionism. It comes from basically, first of all, from the logical sense that says, okay, if this is the conflict, and it is, the Jews want a state, the Arabs want the Jews not to have a state, then the conflict ends in one of two ways. Ends. Not end is what we have all the time. Either the Jews don't have their state, and that's what our enemies are working on every day, or the Arabs let go of their singular obsession with the Jews not having a state. And that's what I call Arab Zionism. I was at a conference many years ago in Vienna, Making Peace. And I said what I've been saying for years, the day the Palestinian Arabs end their century-long war against Zionism, the day they have a constructive vision that wants to live next to a Jewish state rather than on its ruins, we'll have peace. And they're not refugees and no return. So someone who was sitting to the left of me, physically and ideologically, said, wait, you want the Palestinians to be Zionists? And I said yes, and the audience chuckled. And it was like, let me make my case for a moment here. For me to be invited as a peace-seeking centrist Israeli, let's say, it had to be known and assumed that I support the Palestinian Arab to self-determination, to dignity, to whatever political arrangements they wish to be sovereign. Why is it suddenly such a crazy ask that they recognize the equal right of the Jewish people, and I'm not greedy, it doesn't have to be the exclusive right, the superior right, the equal right of the Jewish people to self-determination in their homeland? This is Arab Zionism. Why is it such a crazy ask? So this is how I began to develop the idea. I know it sounds crazy.
Accepting the right, really accepting the right of Jews for a homeland in the land of Israel.
Exactly. And enough with the white European settler colonialist crusaders, which are all just synonyms for saying your foreigners get out. And flip that prism essentially to the Abrahamic vision that says, actually, as Arabs and Muslims, we know that the Jewish people have a history here. And the state of Israel is merely the modern political expression of this unbroken connection.
You mentioned the settler colonialism, which is, learned a lot in academies around the world and university. What's both fascinating and very frustrating is that instead of seeing the Palestinian narrative soften over time, like you hope and expect, the opposite has happened. I mean, Western audiences are increasingly convinced by the Palestinian narrative that Zionism is the problem, that Israel doesn't have an initial right to exist, and that, the solution is from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. How do you explain the way that narrative has moved, from the fringe into mainstream in the West?
So here I go back to the metaphorical tunnels, because ultimately the rise of anti-Zionism in the West and Palestinianism are essentially the same thing. This has been, you can see it, for example, we just marked 50 years for the Zionism is Racism resolution. This is a classic placard strategy, repeated endlessly and laundered through the UN as an institution of prestige, even though it shouldn't be. Even though that resolution was repealed in the 90s, the entire infrastructure that it created within the United Nations for what was called Palestinian rights remains untouched, because that is always how it worked together. Palestinianism was the positive way to promote anti-Zionism. I'm not against anything, I'm for Palestinian rights. But the vision of what Palestine is was always the erasure of the collective Jew. It's just that it used to be more in the Soviet Union, the non-aligned movement, and now we see it in the West. And that's why it kind of hits us more, because it's at home, it's at the West, especially for Jews. They see it in the institutions that they literally built, human rights organizations, social justice organizations, the academia. So it's basically the same thing. It's not a coincidence that all the evil words, right? White supremacy and ethnic cleansing and colonialism and racism and apartheid, that all these placard strategy evil words are on the side of Israel, Zionism, Starve David, and all the good words are on the side of Palestinianism, freedom, equality, justice, rights. And this is exactly how it's positioned, good versus evil. And Palestine is the good. This also is the explanation for why we see queers for Palestine, feminists for Palestine. Palestine is climate change. And a lot of people, when they started seeing these placards, were like, this is moronic. Like, don't they understand the values of that society? On the surface level, it sounds stupid. But there's a deeper, sinister logic here that basically says everything good awaits us when we erase the collective Jew. And the symbol of the erasure of the collective Jew is Palestine, literally from the river to the sea. Someone said a while ago that Palestine is the new red flag. The flag of the global utopia, everything good, and that is the new secular utopia. I think it's Mati Friedman who said that a lot of people are so removed from religion in the West that they don't understand religion when it's like staring them in the face. This notion of good versus evil, salvation, doctrine, right? The universities have become churches, and they ostracize and they tell you what to think. And this is an entire system, including the notion of the collective Jew as the obstacle between this dirty, messy world and utopia. And Palestine has just become the symbol of that. It's not about the real people.
Okay, but since we don't want to be dogmatic as the other side, I do want to ask you, do you think Israel's actions and rhetoric contributed to mainstreaming these ideas from the avant-garde, for the academy, to the masses? I mean, the more extreme the Israeli government in Israel became, and we're in a full right government, as it's called in Hebrew, Yamin Maleh Maleh, the stronger the opposition to Israel became and to Israel's existence. Do you see a connection during the past two years?
So I have a greater difficulty to kind of draw the immediate connection. I do have massive criticism of our government, but it's of a different kind. Why do I have greater difficulty in terms of the connection? Because I've been following it for 20, 25 years. I saw Israel propose peace multiple times, have right-wing governments, left-wing governments, conquer territory, retreat from territory. And I kept seeing those metaphorical tunnels still being built, and they never stopped for a moment. It's just what happened is that they blew up because they finally saw this culmination Right after October 7th, there was this placard, "Keep the world clean," what Hussein said, a symbolic participation in the pogrom. What they saw is finally the realization of work of decades. Which
Tunnels were there, but the masses only came in the past 2 years.
And why and how did they come? Because I think, again, we have a bit of a reversal of cause and effect. Because I listened to a very interesting talk by a former Russian Soviet operative. It's clearly their expertise about mass manipulation. And I think we're living through mass manipulation. And he said mass manipulation requires 4 key elements. Simple messages, which Zionism equals racism, all that is. Strong visual symbols, which the placards are. Constant repetition, which is what we see. And prestige. And all these things came together. So you saw the case of genocide taken to the International Court of Justice. And the chair of the court, the president, said in an interview, I'm sure you saw it, she mumbled, we didn't say Israel's committing genocide, but it doesn't matter. Because what happened is this institution of prestige, International Court of Justice, Israel, genocide, that's it. And then the repetition begins, and the prestige. And it has nothing to do, because in Gaza, when people ask me about that, I was like, just to give you a sense of how removed the libel of genocide is from reality, let's talk a minute about what happened in Gaza. Gaza, with the billions that flew into it, with its very capable government and people, ideologically decided to focus on turning all of Gaza into a single integrated weaponized landscape in order to destroy what the Jews have built rather than build for themselves. After the invasion, they took our hostages. People normalized the fact that it was a legitimate bargaining chip, a negotiating situation. In every other war, it is understood that civilians who want to leave the territory should be able to do so. Here, all the human rights organizations said no, because if they leave Gaza, it's ethnic cleansing. If they stay, it's genocide. We are facing an enemy who's made it their doctrine to not follow international law and to erase the most basic element of international law, which is the distinction of combatant and civilian. And under all these conditions, where Israel's under magnifying glass, the combatant to civilian ratio is about 1:1 to 1:2. So what I tell people is that in 10 years, in a military journal, this will be written as exemplary, but no one will care anymore. So this is the gap between the libel and the action. Now we have an incompetent government of people who do not understand where the war is. My biggest criticism of Israel is that we thought the war is in Gaza. Part of the war was in Gaza. But the Palestinians understood that most of the war was around the world, in people's minds. They understood that. And we continued to fight one kind of war when they were fighting a very different one. So when I say we have an incompetent government, it's not just that, oh my God, just the rubbish they say. It's that they don't understand where the war is really taking place. And that, I believe, had tremendous impact, because we're leaving people essentially at the mercy of this 360 degrees, 24/7 mass manipulation onslaught, and we have barely nothing on the Israeli side. Ultimately, people had to rely on non-official Israelis like Chaviv and myself and Elon Levy, because the government didn't do its job.
So you think if the Hasbara was better, if Israel had better PR, things would look different? Because my last guest here was Yair Lapid, and he said, no, friend, it's not only Hasbara, it's the reality.
So the reason I don't put it at something so small, it's the entire war. For years, I went to the government so many times. Even people would say, oh, Einat, anti-Zionism is just an excuse that the right wing uses in order to avoid criticism. And I was like, no, something sinister is being built. We need to understand. And it's not about occupation or settlements. It's about nothing less than the eradication of the collective Jew. And we dismiss that. So it's not just hasbara, like explaining our position, which we also need to do much better. Because people are looking for people who want to like, they understand that something insane is going on, and we're leaving them with like struggling to find facts. But this is something bigger. We didn't let our allies understand what kind of war is being fought. We didn't understand what are the mechanisms of the enemy. We fell into a lie that it's only Hamas, thereby completely obfuscating that it's an ideology of eradication and elimination that is not limited to one group. So for me, it's the highest level of policy making. It's not about sending a nice-looking English speaker to TV.
Well, okay, from tunnels, I want to shift our conversation to bridges, okay? Because you really have been like at the intersection between Israel and American Jewry for many years. From what you have seen, what has changed in the relationship between the Israelis and American Jews since October 7th? I mean, in the notion of Jewish peoplehood, do you detect a change?
Yes, and something really good. I know a lot of people focus on the young generation, and what I saw, and I think that will have a lasting impact, and I said it to many communities that I visited. As you know, my work has always been about going around the world and speaking to Jewish communities, but after October 7th, I did that even more, and every single Jewish community that I visited would tell me things like, we are hosting soldiers with PTSD. We are working with Nova Festival survivors. We are working with the hostage families. And what happened, as I'm sure you know, for me, dealing with the Jewish world was always like, you know, especially in the Knesset, it was like a hobby. There's no votes in that. And for Israelis, they knew that there's Jews somewhere, and that's about it. Suddenly, the connection became very direct, very visceral. Israelis met Jews and experienced the Jewish people not as an abstraction, but as something very immediate. And I believe this will have lasting consequences, because the sense of being a Jewish people has been dramatic and personal, and now there are many more Israelis that get it in their bones what it means. And I will say also something for me. You know, being in Israel, you're often, that's the success of Zionism, you're often kind of just a bit removed from what it means to be in the Jewish condition. And, you know, you learned that too in literature, Kafka, the Metamorphosis. Someone wakes up one day and they're a disgusting big insect. What a weird story, right? After October 7th, I got it. I understood why only Jewish Kafka could write that story, because suddenly Jews, especially in the West, who by now grew up one generation, two generations, to believe that being Jewish is prestigious, fun, easy, social justice, there's a cachet. They're waking up one day and they're giant, disgusting insects. They're genocidal baby killers. But they're the same person. But now they're in an environment that tells them that they are this giant, disgusting insect. And they don't have the tools to deal with it. So I, too, had a much better understanding of what it means to live the Jewish condition, something that happily in Israel we were somewhat separated for. So these, I think, will have lasting impact.
Is, from your experience, one thing that Israelis tend to misunderstand about their fellow American Jews, and one thing that American Jews often misunderstand about Israelis?
First of all, what it means to be the difference between living a minority and a majority. That ultimately is the basics. And there's a great piece by the JPPI's very own Shlomo Fisher that says, American Jews are Protestants, Israeli Jews are Catholics. I highly recommend people read it. It kind of explains why we talk often past each other in our understanding in the role of religion and state. In America, it's a competitive capitalist system. You don't like your rabbi, you don't like your synagogue, you create another one, you go shop around for another one. In Israel, it's only one Jewish country, so we're basically stuck arguing with each other. And there's no other Jewish country, even though I know some people toy with the idea, but there's no other Jewish country that we can go to.
Yeah, but although I hope that one day we can shop inside Israel better when it comes to Judaism and, the different options. Okay, Einat, we've reached the final part of our conversation, our Jewish Crossroads questionnaire, 5 quick and fun questions. Are you ready? What's your earliest Jewish memory?
My earliest Jewish memory. I guess it's really difficult to separate. I guess watching on the shishi table, remember there was always this rabbi on television in the evening when there was only one channel reading the Parashat HaShavua? I guess that's my memory.
If you could meet any Jewish figure from history, it could be, modern history, ancient history, who would it be and why?
God?
Oh, okay. That's the first one, first time. You're ambitious, Einat. And why?
Would have to act. There'll be a lot of questions, and might
An
as
endless
well
conversation, to say the least.
Right?
Yeah. Okay. What is your favorite or most meaningful Jewish tradition?
It will have to be, first of all, I'm a huge fan of Hanukkah, by far my favorite holiday. Really love that it's coming up, love everything about it, the story, the songs, the fact that it became the most Zionist the Zionists kind of revived it as an incredibly important holiday. But the ongoing tradition that I like is, of course, that even when you're completely secular like me, Friday night dinner, the family gets together, like Saul Singer and Dan Senior called it Thanksgiving every weekend.
Yeah. If you could jump 100 years into the future in one sentence, what would you hope to see for the Jewish people?
Arab Zionism. That is super easy. I would want to see an Arab and Islamic world that finally got it. They got how wasteful and stupid it was to obsess about the non-existence of a Jewish state, and they embrace it.
What's one Jewish word? It can be Hebrew, English, whatever language you choose, that feels particularly meaningful to you right now.
Hineni.
Nice. Dr. Einat Wilf, thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Jewish Crossroads. We'd love to hear from you, so feel free to write to us at jewishcrossroadspod@gmail.com. Thank you to Tomer Atzabi Bar, who edited this chapter. We'll see you next time, same place, same journey, with a new voice. See you soon.